said, my name is Gary Simmons, and I was a capital markets lawyer at Cleary Gottlieb before finally escaping and ultimately ending up running the high yield and prime services divisions at AFME. I've been involved in trying to reform and to some extent harmonize insolvency laws across Europe for many years, but there never seemed to be enough political or even commercial will to do so until perhaps now. And I'm very happy that this is being taken seriously by so many people, including a lot of you here today. I would never presume to say that I know how this really feels, but sometimes it seems like I've been pregnant with this issue for many, many, many years, and the baby's finally being born. I started my career at Cleary in New York, and after trying a few different things, I ended up working in a very busy high-yield bond practice. After a couple of years of working on mostly South American high-yield deals, I transferred to the London office and immediately noticed that high-yield practice there wasn't quite as busy as New York. Another difference that came to my attention was that unlike the US, where the split for corporate funding was roughly 70% capital markets and 30% bank loans, in Europe it was the opposite, roughly 70% bank lending and 30% capital markets. I guess there are many reasons for Europe's reliance on bank lending as opposed to capital markets. Some are historical, as companies have established relationships with banks over the years and are accustomed to working with banks to raise funding. There's also the fact that many companies may see bank loans as easier to negotiate, less intrusive with respect to disclosure and legal obligations, and also a bit more flexible when it comes to amending terms or obtaining waivers for certain corporate actions. In addition, I think that some companies in Europe might still attach some degree of stigma to raising funds through certain capital market instruments like high-yield bonds. As the financial crisis unfolded, however, unfavorable economic conditions, capital requirements, and other restraints on bank lending, as well as other factors, meant banks were less able to extend credit to companies, and companies were forced to seek greater access to capital markets. Somewhat related to this is the European Commission's CMU Action Plan. The Commission saw the negative effects of Europe's somewhat fragmented capital markets and saw merit in improving economic efficiency by creating a larger, more integrated pan-European capital market. One positive effect of the CMU would be to enhance economic resilience by reducing Europe's reliance on bank financing. The financial crisis highlighted both the heavy reliance on bank financing in Europe and also the interdependence between the financial health of banks and sovereigns as an important source of systemic weakness. Both factors were also found to restrain the pace of recovery. Of course, in order for companies to optimize the opportunities provided by Europe's capital markets, there must be a sufficient pool of willing investors. Therefore, the CMU includes incentives for investors to provide capital markets financing to European companies and seeks to increase confidence in capital markets as well as certainty with respect to investments in European companies. For this reason, the CMU includes insolvency reform across Europe as one of the means to grow and improve European capital markets and instill more confidence in the system. Insolvency laws are very important to the bond markets. As a former high-yield lawyer, I can tell you that structuring, negotiating, and coordinating a bond issuance, particularly a cross-border deal, is already complicated enough without taking into account the effects of divergent and sometimes confusing insolvency laws and practices. Having 28 different insolvency regimes makes it harder to understand and make provision for the risk involved in investing in European bonds. One of my last deals at Cleary involved a Greek issuer. Now, you might say this was bad enough, but the issuer had subsidiaries in Bulgaria, Romania, the Ukraine, and a couple of other jurisdictions. Each subsidiary provided a guarantee and also pledged assets as security for the bond. Obviously, each guarantee and security interest would be governed by the law where the guarantor or the security is actually located, and therefore the disclosure in the offering document had to describe adequately and accurately the relevant insolvency implications in each of those jurisdictions. Now, let's just say a few years later the company gets into trouble. In an ideal world, you would expect that much of the heavy lifting and analysis on the insolvency implications would have been completed by the time the investors made their investment decision, and as I said, would have been adequately and accurately described in the offering document. Therefore, you would assume that investors would already have a pretty good idea of what happens next. But now let's make a reasonable assumption that each of those jurisdictions has reformed their insolvency laws since the bond was issued. Now the parties, particularly the investors, would have to go back and analyze the reforms in each of those jurisdictions to understand how they might affect the outcome in their respective recovery. Let's further assume that the Greek issuer has decided to take advantage of a Comey shift and shift the proceedings to another, say, seventh European jurisdiction. Now, not only would reality be very different from what was disclosed in the offering document, but it would also be very different from what the investors originally expected and agreed to. So an already confusing and complicated process will become significantly more complicated and confusing, and the process will become much more time-consuming, much more costly, and, as noted by our previous panelists, this divergence from what the investors originally expected and agreed to would likely have the negative effect of raising the cost of capital. In my opinion, a lot of these effects would be greatly lessened if there were some harmonization of insolvency laws, or at least minimum standards across Europe. Now, there are a lot of factors that could affect the outcome of a European insolvency proceeding. In addition to the peculiarities of the country in which the proceeding is being heard, the area of the country may also have an effect. In some areas of certain countries in Europe, a judge might hear a normal civil or equity case on one day, and then be expected to hear a very complicated insolvency proceeding the next. In many cases, these judges may not have the required experience and expertise to completely understand and analyze the number of corporate, regulatory, and financial issues that may arise in an insolvency proceeding, particularly a cross-border proceeding, and this can add another layer of uncertainty. Over the years, in discussing insolvency reform across Europe, I've run into opposition from many different sources. Some argue that Europe-wide insolvency reform would be too complicated and unwieldy and would probably not have much effect. My answer to that is that there has been some progress made with respect to bank resolution, which, while not exactly the same, has some similarities. I also point to Europe's objective to develop and maintain a single rule book, and its implementation of Europe-wide regulations such as MiFID, EMIR, AIFMD, SFTR, CSDR. I could go on and on. The point is that insolvency could ultimately play a role in each of these areas covered by these regulations, yet when that happens, stakeholders are left at the mercy of 28 different insolvency regimes, and this can't make sense. Others say that there are certain norms and practices that should not be disturbed, or that countries have made certain agreements with their citizens about how their employment, property, contract, and other rights will be protected, and that these agreements can't be broken. While there may be some merit to these arguments, I believe that they must be balanced against the overall goal of improving certainty and confidence in European capital markets. I believe that if we have more specifically experienced insolvency judges, more specialized insolvency courts, more highly qualified insolvency practitioners and administrators, we can be clever enough to strike the right balance between these concerns and the overall goal. And we can do that in a way that's fair and reasonable, and importantly, that's necessary to give a viable company a chance to, a second chance to recover. Nonetheless, some argue that insolvency reform would be best left to individual national governments. In my opinion, again, this hasn't really worked, and I believe this makes it harder to make real progress in improving European capital markets. I'll now say a few brief words about the 2014 European Commission recommendations. I won't go into much detail because I assume that most of you are familiar with the recommendations already. But since the recommendations were issued, over 11 countries have reformed their insolvency laws. These reforms range from large jurisdictions like the UK, Italy, France, Spain, to smaller countries like Croatia, Cyprus, and Slovenia. When the Commission evaluated the response to their recommendation, they noted that the states that had instituted insolvency reforms generally believed that they had adequately addressed the points raised in the recommendation, but the Commission disagreed. The evaluation ultimately concluded that the recommendations had not succeeded in having their desired impact because they were only partially implemented by a significant number of member states, including those that had launched reforms since the recommendations were issued. There's strong support for the positive effects of strengthening convergence of insolvency laws across Europe rather than completely leaving it to individual member states. The Commission's recommendation highlight that further harmonization of minimum standards for European insolvency regimes would help to facilitate more predictable and orderly outcomes for corporate restructurings. The AFME insolvency study that we published estimates that a 10 percentage point increase in expected recovery rates would be associated with a fall in bond spreads of between 18 and 37 basis points. The study also estimates that if all EU countries raise their recovery rates to 85%, this would increase EU GDP by between 41 and 78 billion euros over the long term, and increase total EU employment by 600,000 to 1.2 million jobs. As stated, stronger insolvency regimes can help to increase recovery rates, reduce the time required to conduct insolvency proceedings, lower the cost of credit, increase GDP and employment, and also generally increase certainty and confidence in European capital markets. At the risk of overkill, I'll also note that the IMF found that sound insolvency regimes enable faster deleveraging. The EC has found that sound pre-insolvency regimes speed up non-performing loan adjustments, and other studies have concluded that countries with poor investor protection and countries with poorer investor protection have smaller and narrower capital markets, and the ECB concluded that efficient investor protection increases access to credit. We cannot expect the problems caused by divergent national insolvency regimes to be resolved at the individual country level. In Europe, even with all the reforms that have been made, once a company enters into informal insolvency proceedings, it is much more likely that it will end up in liquidation rather than being given a chance to restructure and continue as a going concern. It's no coincidence that with Chapter 11, a U.S. insolvency proceeding provides a much greater chance for a viable company to restructure and return to normalcy. Now, I'm not advocating dropping Chapter 11 into Europe or even a full harmonization of European insolvency laws, but I do think that we need at least a minimum standard on insolvency across Europe and a concerted effort by stakeholders to implement those minimum standards with the aim of improving efficiency and confidence in Europe's capital markets. In conclusion, I wanted to be brief. I'll say that AFME generally supports the implementation of minimum standards across Europe, and AFME and its members will continue to take part in the relevant discussions and advocacy, and we definitely look forward to seeing the Commission's legislative proposal in a few weeks. Thank you.